changing in Ukraine. The legal regime is being ousted, with Nuland, Deputy State Secretary, handing out cookies, or whatever that was, to protesters. Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, France, Poland, the Baltic states demand the crowd, the people, to overturn the government. There was a madness and chaos and collapse. And against that background, the negotiations are taking place. There's Mr. Kerry sitting there, reading out some documents, and Minister Lavrov is trying to tell him to look not as much at the papers, but to listen about the facts that are on the ground, that are really taking place at the moment. So he tells him about the history of Ukraine. He starts telling him about what's going on there, about what Ukrainians are, what Russians are, and what the Kievan Rus is. 6 months passes, and that's enough for the regime in Ukraine to be overturned, Crimea to go to Russia by way of referendum, and there's shooting breaking out. The Kiev regime shoots at people in Donbas and rolls tanks in there. And there's another round of talks with Kerry, and what does Kerry say? He says, Sergei, addressing Minister Lavrov, now I know much more about Ukraine than 6 months ago. Well, what kept you from looking into that right away? How about reading a book, watching a movie on what you do? Not because it doesn't befit people occupying such high positions to be so unqualified. I'm not talking about Kerry right now, because it means people's lives, and you and your family may find yourself in a similar situation. You can have loads of money, you can have a very high office, you can live anywhere, but life can take a very sharp turn.
You were yelling at me a little while ago, so maybe I'm going to give it back to you now. You ready? Maybe, and I know what you're saying, and you're absolutely right, Maria. The U.S. and NATO were doing military exercises in the Black Sea in front of Russians who were just taking their families to go bathe in the beach. They were militarizing Ukraine. They did a coup for a regime change. They did a lot of horrible, awful things that nobody in the world knows enough about, and they should know. Do you ever think that maybe, and I know it's your job and you do a very good job, why weren't you able to convince the rest of the world, look at what they're doing, of course we have to react? Did you ever think that maybe the game plan, the strategy for you and for Russia needs to change so that you can get more people to see the truth? Pardon me for asking.
No, I like tough questions. You know, я вам вот это вот сейчас все обратно отдам.
But let me give it all back to you. The answer is very simple, because the world media are occupied, as simple as that. They're occupied by those who have loads of money and loads of political influence. So the American mass media are not objective, they're not transparent, they're not credible. They are a way of retranslating a political agenda. The American media is employed by American media employs lots of amazing journalists, with amazing education, great professionals, but eventually they all have to make a choice. Either they continue to fight, and then they end up like Tucker Carlson, unemployed, or they have to mutate to suit the agenda they have to pursue. You have read American newspapers, obviously. I spent 3 years in New York, and every day my job was to open newspapers. I had a stack of 5 newspapers every day. By the way, Christian Science Monitor was one of the decent publications, and every day it was like a lottery. Maybe this day I'm lucky to see at least one publication on Russia. And later I realized that the American mass media, the TV, the newspapers, the radio, they pursue a policy that I personally And later I realized, when documents surfaced about USAID, I realized that they call this policy strategic silence. And Russia, let me tell you frankly, I worked there in 2005 till 2008. Russia had two kinds of news. The first kind was criminal news, Russian mafia, terrorist attacks, mafia rumbles, people killed in the streets. And the second kind of news was freaks, like a woman living with 150 cats in her apartment. It's not what I call freaks. That's the sort of people the American media call freaks. And that, given the fact that since 2005 to 2008, Russia built